The prospect of direct confrontation between Israel and Iran is increasingly becoming a tangible scenario. Strong warning from the United States and growing concern over ballistic missile capabilities are making the regional balance more fragile. Do these developments point toward a new war? We will discuss the issue in detail with Serhan Afacan, president of the Iran Research Center. Considering the recent escalation in military and political tensions between Israel and Iran, how likely is a scenario in which the two countries confront each other directly, and how will such a conflict affect regional balances?
First of all, thank you very much for having me in this interview. I am not anticipating a second round of confrontation between Israel and Iran. Many people talk about that, and some people say it's coming up, but I don't see that coming. That is the first point. The second point is, during this 12-day confrontation between these two countries in June, Iran suffered tremendously. From a humanitarian perspective, from a strategic perspective, Iranian cities were bombed, and the Iranian society was somehow traumatized. And I was in Iran about 1 month ago, and I had the chance to personally witness what was going on in this country, and also talk to people about their experiences during this confrontation. So, I mean, the Iranian administration does not want a second round of confrontation. They do not want their cities bombed once again by Israeli air forces, and they do not want their strategic assets and complexes, like, for example, the nuclear sites in Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, to be bombed by Americans. And I think the Trump administration also does not want a second round of confrontation, and they are not in the same line with Netanyahu about this particular issue. We know that Netanyahu went to the United States of America to meet President Trump for a fifth time over the last 9 months, for a fifth time. And many people anticipated that the main theme of this discussion between these two leaders would be a second attack against Iran's strategic facilities. I think President Trump doesn't want that. And I think his team doesn't want that. Witkoff doesn't want that. Hegseth doesn't want that. I think to some extent the foreign minister of the US, Marco Rubio, also doesn't want that. But if a second round of confrontation happens between these two countries, this time I think the regional implications will be a lot more problematic. First of all, from Tehran's side, the Iranian administration, they insist and they emphasize that if a second round of confrontation breaks out between Iran and Israel, this time Iran is going to do everything to disseminate the conflict to the region, which means they are going to use their proxies, or they are going to use what they call the axis of resistance, which refer to the groups in, for example, Lebanon, Hezbollah, and also in Iraq, some Iran-affiliated groups within Hashd al-Sha'abi. And then there are some groups definitely in also different parts of the Middle East, like, for example, Houthis. Iran is also going to use them in a time of a second confrontation between Israel and Iran. And I think that would definitely escalate the tension over the Middle East and in the Middle East. And nobody, including Turkey and also including Saudi Arabia, I think, do not really want that. And as far as I can see, Ankara, for example, and also to some extent Riyadh, they are trying to do their best to prevent a second confrontation between Iran and Israel, because they see that such a scenario is definitely going to destabilize the region.
Iran has witnessed growing public discontent alongside the sharp depreciation of its national currency. To what extent do external actors, particularly Israel, play a direct or indirect role in this process?
I have been following Iran for more than like 20 years. I'm 43 now, and since over the last 20, 23 years, I've been following Iran, and I have witnessed several demonstrations in Iran. Demonstrations which started over political reasons, economic reasons, and somehow social reasons, like, for example, the death of Mahsa Amini in 2022 under police surveillance, and then we witnessed very broad demonstrations almost in every corner of Iran. Okay, so, and also I know, and everybody actually for that matter knows, that Iran has chronic economic problems. Iran has serious major economic problems. It has a population of around 90 million, which is relatively young. There is a question of unemployment. There is a question of high inflation. People cannot afford their daily lives. So this protest, which started in Tehran, I think is not surprising because there's high inflation, and then there's a collapse of Iran's currency against the US dollar mainly. Okay, so people poured into the streets and they started to protest the economic policies of the government. And as far as I can see, the government also welcomes somehow these protests, and they say, okay, people do have legitimate basis for these protests, and they say we are going to do our best to make sure that the economy is somehow recovered. But that is very difficult. So I mean, we should be looking at this protest as like the previous protests in 2017, 2019, and then 2022. I think these are genuinely popular protests started by people for real, understandable, legitimate concerns and complaints. But as far as outside powers, like, for example, Israel and the United States are concerned, they definitely try to escalate the tension inside the country. Since yesterday, for example, some of the Israeli politicians, both from the government and also the opposition, they share posts on their social medias, like, for example, X, some of them maybe in TikTok, I don't know, Instagram, etc., etc., and they call the Iranian people to rise up against regime and to do their best to change, which is, I think, very problematic. Because once you start saying, I mean, like Israel and the United States, especially Israel, start saying such things about the genuine protests in Iran, these protests are easily securitized by the Iranian government or the Iranian regime. Some people inside Iran, they start saying, for example, that these protests, although not started by Israel, but some start claiming that they were started by Israel. And then they try to make harsh measures against these protesters. But as far as I can tell, the government is at the moment handling these protests quite reasonably and rationally. And at this point, the Iranian people who are on the streets to protect their lives and economies, I think they do not really turn to the Israelis and listen to what they are saying. Their basic concerns are pretty much real, actual, and I think this is going to be the pattern of these current protests in Iran.
US President Donald Trump stated during his meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that the United States could carry out new military strikes if Iran attempts to restart its nuclear program. Following this warning, how might Iran's nuclear strategy and the broader regional power struggle evolve?
I think President Trump doesn't have an appetite to start a second confrontation with Iran. He doesn't want a second war. He doesn't want a second conflict between Iran and Israel, and definitely between Iran and the United States of America. And such remarks about Iran's nuclear program, ballistic missile program, I think they are not new. President Trump has been saying that since he sat on the chair as president 9 months ago. He warned the Iranians that he would not allow their nuclear program to the weaponization of their nuclear program, so to speak. And he also told them that Iran's ballistic missile program should also be checked and taken under control. But Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think he definitely wants a second confrontation with the Iranians. He knows that the job is not finished. This is what he has been saying since the end of the first confrontation. And from his perspective, a second round of confrontation is necessary to finish the job, so to speak. But I think the President Trump doesn't really agree on that. His warnings about Iran's nuclear program and also the ballistic missile program, I think, should be understood in its own context. First of all, the Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic of Iran, they do not say that they are after developing nuclear weapons. Quite to the contrary, they insist that their nuclear program is exclusively and solely for peaceful purposes, for medical purposes, for energy, civil use, etc., etc. And they say that they are not trying to develop nuclear weapons. Okay, and the President Trump tells them that you should not be doing that anyway. But the question is, President Trump does not want the Iranians to enrich the uranium at any level. Any level. For example, in this nuclear deal signed in July 2015, Iran was allowed to enrich the uranium up to 3%, 3.67%. The President Trump says you should not be doing that either. And if this is what the Iranians doesn't accept. They don't accept. They say that I have the right to run my nuclear program for peaceful purposes. And I think on this they have to negotiate. And President Trump left an open door for negotiations. And he said the Iranians want to talk. And he said it's good to talk and make a deal. And I think they are going to restart the talks maybe in Moscow or somewhere else. I don't know for the moment, because Witkoff is also in favor of negotiation and talks with the Iranians rather than starting a new confrontation. But this ballistic missile program is, I think, more difficult because Iran says it has every right to defend itself. And this ballistic missile program is first and foremost for defensive purposes. Because they say Israel has a very modern, improved technology to attack Iran. And then these ballistic missiles are the only assets in the service of the Iranian state to defend themselves. I think these talks and also negotiations about this ballistic missile program is going to be a lot more difficult. But I think there is also still an open door and room for negotiations on that particular issue as well.